It's great to be here with everyone. Thanks for making the trip into DC. Hope everybody's having, for those of you who aren't here, that you're enjoying our unseasonably nice weather. As was said, I'm Alejandro Moreno. I lead the part of the Department of Energy called the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And this is effectively one of the closest things the federal government has to a clean tech innovation shop. That's really what we do. I'll expound on that a little bit. But we focus on three major sectors: renewable energy, which my day job is just to lead the renewable energy sector. The transportation sector, focus on both vehicles, heavy duty and light duty vehicles, and bigger transportation, air, marine. Have a slightly different perspective on biomass than the dean. And also really focusing on how do we innovate in those sectors with a real focus on clean technology, but innovate in those sectors in a way that benefits people. So not just sort of having abstract metrics of emissions, for example, be the only measure of how we design and implement technologies, but really recognizing that all the technologies we have, particularly around buildings, industry, transportation, that they have primary uses that people need first, and then the means in which they generate or use energy often come second or third or a little bit farther down the line for people who are using them. Obviously, a big focus on creating jobs and ensuring that a clean energy transition provides economic opportunities, revenues, jobs in communities, and has benefits that are equitable. Certainly, we've seen both positive and negative impacts of energy decisions and infrastructure over the history of the country skew very much towards certain types of impacts or towards certain groups and others towards other groups. Certainly, how much money you have often has a huge say in what level of engagement and what level of impact you have on the energy infrastructure around you. And that's something DOE is really increasingly conscious of, and looking at tools and approaches that we can ensure, compared to those that have more resources to come, for example, to conferences like this. Obviously, the administration right now has very clear emissions and climate goals, and they are to create a fully, we call net zero power sector, so a power sector with no additional emissions by 2035, and a net zero energy sector by 2050. These are ambitious goals. Getting to a fully net zero power sector by 2035, just as an example, it's going to require building new wind and solar at a rate that's 4 to 5 times more than we've ever seen before. That may happen with some of the investments that we've seen, or some of the incentives, rather, that we've seen come out of the Inflation Reduction Act passed, but there's still a lot of work to do. And on the buildings and industry, certainly the amount of energy that we consume and sort of reducing the rate of increase of that has a huge impact on how much new infrastructure will ultimately be needed. And the way in which we consume it, and particularly some of the technologies that we can put in our buildings, has a huge impact on the other point that the dean mentioned, which is whether or not our power system is ready and able to accept large amounts of things like wind and solar. And so there are big roles that buildings play in both of these. And education buildings, as much as any, you probably know this, but education buildings consume about 10% of the electricity of the commercial building sector. They're the second highest consumer of electricity and the highest consumer of natural gas in the commercial building sector. They're huge, and this makes sense. Don't let anybody tell you this as a shame. No, not at all. The K through 12 teaches, 50 million students in the US? Of course, you have huge energy footprints, but what that is it's an opportunity to, together as the education system, as those of you that are making decisions or influencing decisions about how schools use energy, you have a huge opportunity to affect energy consumption in the US, both in overall amount of what's consumed, a potential switch from direct fossil fuels to electrification or other forms of heating, and even from procurement. You have huge procurement power in where your electricity comes from, and banding together can certainly get good deals for things like wind and solar on the grid. But don't just do it for, the administration or large-scale reasons that are abstract to you. Obviously, you have to make decisions around your energy use that make sense for you in your district right now. And recognizing that, from my perspective, I didn't initially get into renewables from a climate perspective. I was one of those people 20 years ago that was really bought into peak oil and recognizing that we needed to move off of some of our really volatile and unreliable sources of energy that we were dependent on. I'm certainly motivated by climate in my position right now, but I see the value proposition of renewables and clean energy as being really, really broad. We just came out with a study, we released it last week, I think, our National Renewable Energy Lab, that showed that if all of the potential of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, these big tax credits for renewables, if they all were utilized, and we would get to about 80% of the power sector being based on renewables by, I think it was by 2030, we could save up to $100 billion in bulk power system costs. That's not nothing. And a lot of that will accrue, obviously, to individual consumers of electricity. Beyond that, you have, if renewable energy gives particularly individual actors at the size of a campus, where you have enough demand to have a little bit of economy of scale. It's not the same thing as sort of a single rooftop solar, but enough sort of autonomy over your own system, an ability to have much more certainty in where your power is coming from, and particularly in the face of potential disruptions to the power system, whether they're cyber related, whether they're natural disaster related. I think I was reading yesterday, I think that half of all K through 12 schools are in an elevated flood risk zone right now, and about a third are at substantially increased risk for heat, like major heat disruptions. And recognizing that is a threat to the grid itself and what that's going to do, that will provide the exact same pressures on the grid everywhere in a region at the same time, which will make it much less likely, or I should say much more likely, that there will be coincident spikes in demand on what's already a finite system. If you have your own solar system with batteries, which now we have the technology to basically make that the same cost as the grid, or if you're a big enough school or district, wind turbines. We had a big Wind for Schools program a few years ago. You mitigate a lot of that risk. Now, obviously, if renewable systems aren't invulnerable, they're pieces of infrastructure as well. But certainly what we're starting to see in Puerto Rico, in Florida, for example, is solar systems, for example, survive really, really strong weather conditions, some of the hurricanes, in ways that often the many disparate parts of a grid-connected system won't always. You think of above-ground distribution lines, for example, which are really quite vulnerable. So there are lots of reasons potentially to be looking at energy efficiency improvements, to be looking at renewables that go far beyond just sort of wide-scale concern about climate, although that's certainly one of them. So how does DOE fit into all of this? For those that don't know, the department we're primarily an R&D organization. Lately, in the last few years, we've become much more engaged in what we call sort of deployment. And we have new offices. I think you'll hear from somebody in our new office, one of our new infrastructure offices, that are focused on actually giving entities money to install infrastructure. But we also do a lot of work that's focused on market barriers and on addressing some of the structural institutional issues that make it more difficult to buy or to install a piece of equipment that may otherwise be cost competitive. I think somebody mentioned the importance of your contractor just knowing about certain technologies, having that in their default roster. That makes a huge difference. If you think of yourself as a homeowner, many of us I'm sure are, you default to what the experts tell you. You say, what are my choices? If it's not one of the choices, you're not gonna know enough to install it, even if it's something that you ultimately might have chosen. So that's the type of work that we do. A couple examples recently. we announced sort of our first big tranche of investments through the Renew America's Schools grant. I'm not going to talk much about that because we have Sarah Zaleski from DOE, I think, talking about this later today. But it's a $500 million program really focused on infrastructure. We have a technical assistance program called the Efficient and Healthy Schools Campaign. This is an interagency effort between us, DOE, EPA, and the Department of Education, launched 2 years ago, focused on technical assistance in school districts that want to impact indoor air quality and efficiency improvement. So, it's if you have a particular type of improvement that you want, you can come to us in this group and we can give you technical advice on assessing it and figuring out how best to go about it. We have 102 schools and districts across 39 states who are either part of this or about to be part of this campaign. Similarly, we have our Better Buildings initiative. It's not unique to schools, but for those that want to take another step and say, we know we want to reduce our energy consumption by 20% over the next 10 years, we've got an entire suite of programs that can help do that, including learning from other similar individuals that are managing energy use in buildings like yours, who can trade sort of experiences and tips about how they've done that. It's a purely voluntary commitment. Nobody's coming after you and measuring it at the end. But we're finding most of the people who have joined this program over the last 10 years actually have achieved their goals. And then even bigger for those who are really interested in becoming a fully net zero campus, where all the emissions that you produce are offset by, for example, credits from buying renewable energy or others. We have a wide sort of swath of guidelines, tips, and technical assistance for particularly some focused specifically on schools for achieving that. And even if you want to go one step beyond that, we have a program called Connected Communities. We have, I think, a few universities that are engaged there, but it's multiple different organizations and users of buildings, users of energy in a community, in a fixed locality, that are working together not just to reduce overall use, but to build in new, more connected appliances, usually at sort of the individual building level, that talk back to the grid and can save you a lot of money because they turn off, for example, when you don't need them. You program them with a certain amount of flexibility. And if, for example, the wind dies down in the middle of the night, you maybe stop charging things until the wind picks back up earlier in the morning, if you don't need something until afterwards, right? You have a lot of control over what you can do, but then the utilities are part of this program, and then they can measure the impact that requires them, the reduced impact for new investment, and ultimately a lot of those savings will come back to the end users themselves. That last program is much more on the cutting edge, trying to understand some of these internal dynamics between use and generation and management of the system itself. And lastly, we have a lot of programs that aren't necessarily focused specifically on schools, but schools can take advantage of. Things like retrofits that we have in a number of our buildings programs. We know just a couple examples, the installation of geothermal heating and cooling done at an elementary school in Manchester, Connecticut, along with PV arrays, and basically completely overhauled the entire building's energy profile. I don't have the data. I thought I had the data on how much energy they ended up reducing, but we're from the conversations I've had with them, really enthusiastic about the passive geothermal heating system that they were able to put in, which avoids, of course, any direct connection to the grid whatsoever. Another school district in Arkansas that added solar panels to its school a few years ago, this one I loved, was they told us apparently they saved so much money on their energy efficiency that they were able to raise the pay of their teachers. So that's a good story. We do. Excellent. I want to hear all about this. Yes. As DOE, I feel like I have to say I can't promise that in all situations, but definitely want to hear how that worked. And the last thing I'll say is of course, in addition to the responsibilities that you have as in making energy decisions about your school, which are they're real, very meaningful decisions that relate to the health and the comfort of the entire student body. These obviously take primacy. You also have an opportunity to be engaging with the future of our country every single day. And the more, not just through formal academic training, but the more schools engage in and explore some of the more innovative options that we have for bringing energy that's clean, that's affordable, that's reliable into our schools, the more opportunities you have to engage students in that process itself. And again, create the level of awareness that we have options, that we have the number of different ways we have to generate energy cost effectively, reliably in this country. Compared to when I started my career just 20 years ago, it's night and day. Things that 20 years ago were not cost competitive. Solar panels 20 years ago, they were a fun niche technology. Now they are the cheapest way to produce bulk power. Getting students engaged in that and finding ways to also use that as real hands-on learning experience, that seems to me like an opportunity of a lifetime, an opportunity to, more than any one decision in any individual school, really change the way our country as a whole approaches energy. And that's really what the clean energy transition is about. It's recognizing, we have many, many different options thanks to huge amounts of research that were done, much of it in the United States over the last 30 years, and now's our time to take advantage of that. So really excited to be here, happy to take any questions, but it's ultimately you and millions of people like you, certainly not those of us that work here in DC, unless you work in the school system, whose decisions are really going to be driving this. And so, again, thanks for being here. Thanks for taking the time to listen.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions, but this time I'll let the audience start with any questions, and then I have a bunch hopefully I can sneak in. Anybody want to kick us off?
A burning one for me has to do with you having any influence on the utilities accepting putting more distributed energy onto their grids and how to deal with it, because that seems to be the biggest barrier that I encounter trying to move at a fast pace.
That's okay. Influence I would use in sort of a light touch way. Obviously, one of the downsides of or the limitations, I should say, of the way DOE is structured. Probably an upside if you're in a utility professional is that DOE can't come in and say, go do this, right? And generally, if we try to do that, it is counterproductive. But what we do is we have a lot of different programs, both from a technology perspective and a technical assistance program that work with utilities to understand how to manage power systems with much higher levels, for example, of wind and solar. We have a big program right now that's out actually for applications called Clean Energy to Communities, where we bring together local governments and utilities local governments in particular, who have very high renewable energy goals, recognizing that if they don't involve the utilities from the beginning, they're not going to reach those goals, because ultimately it's a utility who needs to be comfortable with it. Utilities take their responsibility for keeping the lights on affordably extremely seriously, as they should. We know that there are ways of operating a power system with actually really high levels of both utility scale wind and solar, but also high levels of resources on the distribution system, and doing so reliably. But it's a question of getting people comfortable with a system that really looks different from what they're used to. Clean Energy to Communities. It's run out of the National Renewable Energy Lab.
So I'm with Modesto City Schools, and we've applied for the Renewing America Schools program as well as the GRIP that's out right now. And I just want to say thank you for those programs and getting those started. But is there anything we can do, you guys can do succinctly, of working on the disparities of different utility companies? Like I was previously at Stockton in PG&E territory, and now we're at MID. And the good and the bad of that is that the big entities have a lot more funding, whereas a lot of the smaller utilities, irrigation districts, give you lower cost up front but the services and the amount of things that you can get are different. The amount of services like S-chip or anything else, all the different programs. So I'm just wondering talk about some of the differences in the utilities and how you guys work with them.
Again, it's a really good point, and it's not something where there's any silver bullet. There are really big differences in resources, and some utilities, I don't need to tell you, but we'll have one or two people responsible for the entire electricity sector, and that it becomes very hard to learn how to do something different when you don't have enough resources to actually do what you're doing. We work on it through a couple different ways, through a number of the infrastructure programs where we're making money available for actual deployment. They come with resources for technical assistance to learn more. That said, if you don't have basic staffing even to take advantage of that technical assistance, I recognize it can be hard. We in my shop, we have a fellowship program that is available where we place people in a few types of often understaffed organizations. It includes public utility commissions, their staff, but it also includes small municipal utilities or rural co-ops. And then a lot of the technical assistance work that we do just generally that isn't necessarily associated with a big chunk of infrastructure funding is working to build up the capabilities of a number of those types of utilities through organizations like NARUC, not NARUC, I'm blanking on the NRECA, the Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And similarly, Rural Electric Cooperative, actually, we found some have self-organized into groups. There's a really interesting group on the western slope in Colorado where there's an alliance of about, I think, 11 or 12 small rural co-ops, all with similar issues where they can learn from each other in ways that they might not have been able to do. And we're encouraging those. Again, there's no one way to do it. It can't all come from DOE. It's a really important problem, and we're trying to get around that in a few different ways.
So thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I'm from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a wild system of 2,560 local governments. And 67 counties, and their jurisdictions create all kinds of, differences. And then you layer 500 school districts into that. And we have what's called the T, right? You have Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and then this thing in the middle. And so trying to get assistance for people to do things like energy planning in a state that is also the 46th or 47th in our school funding formula. So it's wildly unfair. I'm really interested in how your office and DOE can help, especially some of those rural communities, right? And then also like high intensity, poorer urban districts, because they face a number of the same issues. How can you help with that? Thank you.
Sure, that's a lot of local government. So a couple of the programs I mentioned up here, actually, the Healthy and Efficient Schools Initiative and Better Buildings Initiative. Better Buildings probably more targeted for schools with a bit more resources, whereas the Healthy and Efficient Schools can be, not legally. I'm just trying to think through what's probably who's going to get the most out of it. Those are the programs that are specifically targeted at schools. What I will say is we have more and more work that's specifically targeted at underserved communities, including urban communities, that isn't specific to schools, but is also starting to look at some of the problems that are common across those communities, regardless of the type of institution. Obviously a lot of environmental justice questions, particularly around the health impacts of energy decisions. And a lot of the modeling work that we've done in the past hasn't always looked at those questions. And so certainly interested to know more about what, particularly in urban areas, what are some of the specific issues you're seeing in the school system, and seeing which of those issues are really unique to schools across the state, which of those issues are common to different institutions in a disadvantaged urban area. And there may be programs that have that lens, but that are equally applicable.
Hi there. It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you. We opened an all-electric school building, geothermal, in Massachusetts this year, and we had hoped to have resilience as one of the things that we achieved, but we had a last-mile problem that we couldn't solve, which was the lead engineer poured cold water on the advanced switching gear that we had spec'd for talking, so that the big solar array could talk to the generator, could talk to the building, could talk to the grid. And he was concerned. He knew of an example where the voltage between them hadn't been compatible, and the generator had struggled as a result, and that just spooked everybody. So I just feel like we even wrote advanced switching gear in the RFP. We were all good to go until he said that. So there's just really key sort of technical expertise that isn't there. Thank you.
No, it's really, I mean, that's interesting. Obviously, without knowing the details of your situation, I don't want to comment on the wisdom of that particular decision. I don't know. I will say I've worked in communities where they've had quote unquote experts come in and say, "Oh, you can't do solar. Solar doesn't work." So it depends on the perspective. Certainly, getting a second opinion is probably a good idea. Just a general philosophy of saying, I know a time where something like this didn't work, so it's impossible, is probably not that's not a one-to-one logic chain. But that's not to say that this engineer wasn't right. I don't know. But certainly it's to me, really goes back to the importance of having a lot of the capabilities of the technologies that we work on really well understood and in the toolbox, either metaphorically or literally, of the people that are actually coming in and doing the work in the systems themselves. It is one of the reasons we work really closely with unions, a few different reasons, but making sure that for example, the Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, they are deeply familiar with the capabilities and the continually evolving capabilities of our technologies, because again, if the people you are trusting to make the decisions about the installation of your technologies don't know what the technologies can do, you're not going to get the right answer.
We have time for one more question. Anybody?
She's giving them.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
He should go because I already asked a question.
Okay.
Hand it to Greg. Greg, you want to just speak up?
Yeah. Sure. Bring out my Brooklyn voice. So, any thoughts of adding an S to the ERE acronym for storage? And curious how much of your efforts now are going toward that, incorporated being something for this resiliency question that came up. And I think storage is a big component, not just storage, but the issue of the connectivity, the software needed to make it all work, and partnering with the utilities.
So good news and bad news. The bad news is you've hit on, like any good bureaucracy, we have silos, and storage falls in a different silo. But storage is worked on. It's in our Office of Electricity. The good news is I genuinely am incredibly impressed over the last 5 or 6 years, the way the Department of Energy has broken down a lot of traditionally really rigid silos, where we used to have a very hostile relationship with our Office of Electricity, and now we work together as one. So I actually helped start back in my last job, a broad DOE-wide energy storage program that brought together EERE, the Office of Electricity Storage Program, and it covers battery technologies, but it also covers thermal storage, the other types of mechanical storage, electrochemical storage, hydrogen as storage. And so we coordinate and collaborate and even jointly fund things in a way we never had before. So we can't do this without storage. So the end result is quite positive, even if you'd have a different assistant secretary up here talking about their storage program.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. And